This presentation is over the benefits of James C. McKinney's diagnosis and correction of vocal faults. This book is broken into many different chapters, and then those chapters are then broken down into smaller sections. I have gone through and I have highlighted the 3 sections from each chapter that I believe to be most beneficial. The first chapter is diagnosing vocal faults. The 3 sections I have chosen for this are identifying vocal problems, the classification of vocal faults, and a plan of action. The first section is set standards for ideal singing. It goes with being healthy, and you have to realize nobody's going to come in with a perfect voice. Just like you don't go to the doctor only when you're sick, you have to go for regular checkups. It also talks about how communication with the students is vital, and at being able to get the knowledge from what you know to them in a way that they can understand. The next section goes over the classification of vocal faults. There are many different types of faults that come with singing, whether that just be the musicality of the phrase, pitch, duration, anything. It also goes over the vocal mechanism, so the tongue, the jaw, the lips, and it also goes over the physical aspects of singing, so your breathing, your resonance, your articulation, your phonation. The third section this chapter goes over is a plan of action. It is how to diagnose the faults. So it talks about what's wrong with the sound, what's causing it to sound the way it does, and how do I fix it, what am I going to do about it. It talks about different visual and audible ones. So some faults can be clearly visible. So shaking legs, high shoulders, locked jaw, just kind of a tense state of being, while some are audible, so you have to hear them, so that those go back to your pitch. The next chapter is a basic approach to vocal sound. The 3 sections I have chosen to highlight are the nature of sound, the nature of vocal sound, and semantic problems in describing vocal sound. Starting with the nature of sound itself. Sound comes from the vibration, and how sound travels is what this chapter can go over. It also describes what sound is and how to understand it before you can manipulate it. Next will be the vocal sound. So we have to take the breath, the respiration, the phonation, the resonance, the articulation, and then it also even goes into more explanation of what each of those are. And that's why I believe that this chapter is very vital to the teaching process, because it doesn't only do what I mentioned, but it also breaks each step down. The third one will be the semantic problems in describing vocal sound. Music isn't an exact science, so each person's view of music will be different. Having one person describe it as warm might not mean the exact same thing to other people. And this book kind of sets a standard for what words mean and what each one has to do with it. It also talks about how many of the sounds we use many of the descriptive words we use in music come from nature and other arts, like warm, dark, round, spread. On to chapter 3, posture. This book is very picky in its posture. So the 3 sections I have chosen are a rationale for good posture, a description of good posture, and faults related to posture. So the first section is the rationale behind a good posture. Reasonings for needing the good posture. The skeleton supports and gives shapes to the human. The muscles move and position them. With them not doing the jobs, the muscles create tension, and the best voice can only be had with the body with no tension. A good posture also gets rid of many of the visual faults we mentioned in the first section. So, good posture fixes your sunken chest, and it also can eliminate the extra movement that isn't necessary to singing, but it also creates a sense of confidence in the singer. Description of good posture. The book goes over many different ways to describe the good posture, some of them being alert, balanced, buoyant, erect, free to move, poised, and it also talks about how to get into that position, so going from top to bottom in the body and what each part should be. The third section is the faults related to posture. So it goes over many of the faults we have with it, as in a tilted head, high chin, raised shoulders, slumped over, and many more. And it also talks about what each of those can cause in the singing itself. Chapter 4 is breathing and support. The first section is breathing for singing, second being breath support, and the third is faults related to breathing and support. So breathing for singing, it goes into each step in detail on what a singer's breath should be like. Taking it in low, setting it up, being controlled with it, and it even goes into the exhalation and the recovery of each of these breaths. Second section of breath support it talks about how the breath makes everything work and how the breath can take them into controlling more of their singing. The third section are faults related to breathing. It talks about upper chest breathing. It limits the diaphragmatic expansion. It's visually distracting, wastes energy, and it even goes into more details on how each of these can be an unhealthy breath and can cause faults in the singing process. Chapter 5 is the phonation process. So the first section is the phonatory process, second being characteristics of good vocal sound, and third of faults related to phonation. The phonatory process it goes into detail on what is phonation, and it even goes into different theories of how the voice works, examples being the myoelastic theory and the aerodynamic theory. These both are theories on how our sound is made inside our person, and the book goes into very clear detail on each of those. Second being the characteristics of a good vocal sound. It goes into many details about how the vocal sound should sing, but I don't even think it's that. It also tells you what to look for in a good voice, and how can you teach to sing well if you don't know what sound you are trying to get out. It goes into the positives, so the freely produced, pleasant to listen to, rich, ringing sounds. It also goes into the negatives, so your forced, rasping, hoarse, breathy sounds. The last section is the faults related to phonation, and it talks of the issues in that sound producing process and how it can actually damage the voice and how to take care of specific issues. Then it also gives specific practices you can do to help keep the healthy process alive. Chapter 6 goes into the registration of voices. The first section is what is register, then how many registers are there, and the vocal voice the model voice register. The first one is what is register. This chapter explains what register is, how many there are, and then it gives examples of that model voice in order in this chapter. The first one, it goes into detail about what register is and how many different ones there are, and how singing out of your register is unhealthy or may even be damaging to the voice. How many there are, it goes into detail on the different types of voicing depending on age. It also goes into changing male voices, unchanged, fully changed male voices, and it even goes into children's voices and adults' voices. And then it gives a very descriptive example of the model voice for each register. Chapter 7 is voice classification. First section being a rationale for voice classification, second, criteria for establishing voice classification, and then the dangers of misclassification. This book has a very interesting view on this. It says many people are too obsessed with the classification of being a soprano, tenor, mezzo-soprano, baritone, alto, bass. It believes that it doesn't really matter what part you are assigned. It's more focused on singing healthy and making sure that we stay singing healthy no matter what classification we are. It also goes into detail on what a singer can do versus what they can't do, and how to take that into account when setting up the voice classifications. Then it also goes into the faults in misclassification and how it can damage the voice, how it can set up bad habits, and make the singing process not only unpleasant, but in some cases painful for the individual. Chapter 8 would be resonance. So I went to the vocal resonators, adjusting the resonators, and faults related to resonation. So the first one is the vocal resonators. It talks about how affecting these resonators and what effects it has inside our voice inside our bodies to our voice. Adjusting the resonators goes over the different resonators in the body and how to use them, how to adjust them. And then it even goes into faults with the resonation in the third section, including what happens if you are using an unhealthy resonance, how that will sound, and how to fix those sounds. The ninth chapter is articulation. It goes over the articulatory process, establishing good articulatory habits, and then faults related to articulation. The articulatory process talks about how each piece of our mouth has a function, and what parts of the mouth form our vowels, what parts form our consonants, and how those sounds come about within our mouth. Establishing the good articulatory habits, it talks of how we should be speaking, and it even gives examples of what to be doing and how to be fixing errors you hear, whether you hear them or you see them. Then faults related to articulation, it goes into how unhealthy articulation habits can hurt our singing. Chapter 10 goes into the speaking voice. The first section I chose to highlight is the comparison of speaking and singing. Second being finding the habitual speech level, and then third, common speech faults. The first one goes into detail comparing the speaking and the singing voice on our speaking levels sometimes not being the same as our singing levels, whether that be pitch or even timbre. Then the second section is finding the habitual speech level. So that is finding where we speak most comfortably, and then putting that into our voice while we sing as well. Then the common speech faults are taking habits that we have as speaking and bringing those into our music. This chapter really goes over how to separate the voice that we speak with from the voice that we sing with, and it goes into detail on how to fix that, how to identify it. Chapter 11 is the coordination, and it starts with developing the voice, goes into extending the range, and then lining up the voice. Developing the voice, it talks of extending the range along with lining up the voice. So these three kind of all come together. The coordination is bringing every aspect of the choral singing process into one larger part, and it talks about how each of these faults can be used and fixed, with ways of exercising the voice and the general bending and stretching body exercises that the book also gives, just ways to make the voice healthier and more with a unified sound. Extending the range, it gives many warm-up examples, many ways to practice how to extend that range for the individual. And then lining up the voice. Lining up the voice is a little bit harder to explain, but I found that this book gives a very good example of how to line up the voice with things like the space factor, the depth factors, and then it even goes into things to try to hit and then things to avoid while singing to make the singing more unified. These are many reasons I found that the diagnosis of correction of vocal faults is a very useful tool for any choral situation, for the teacher and for the students. Now, from each chapter I took 3 useful things I found, but each chapter has much more to give to any teaching environment that they can find available to them.